Hi, it's Alexander Russo from The Grade, and this is the Education Show. And I'm delighted to be here today with Tyler Kingkade from NBC News. Tyler, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're here today to talk about all things edtech, about the edtech backlash or freakout or reckoning, depending on your view. What's your view based on the reporting you've done? Where are we with edtech in schools?
To me, I mean, I'm sort of knee deep, chest deep, I don't know, neck deep in this. So to me, it feels like the only thing that people are talking about in schools, but I'm sure that's not true. Uh, it's been my focus for the past few months, and I'm still reporting on it. It's definitely something I'm hearing a lot from administrators are freaking out about. When I talk to education nonprofits or trade organizations, they say that's all they're hearing on the ground is concerns about this. But I don't know. It's kind of hard to separate this from the broader conversation that people are having around social media and AI. And not to say that people are conflating this with those, but I think there's just this general anxiety permeating through society right now around what we're doing technology wise.
Right. And I've always said that schools are soft targets for new things, for better or worse. And schools have turned out to be a bit of a soft target when it comes to education technology. How did you get involved in this story? I feel like you got there some version of first and stayed on it the longest. You can correct me if that's not right, but how did you first get involved? You're not just an education guy. You're do a lot of different things. What's the origin story for Tyler and EdTech?
Yeah, so I mean, I've covered education off and on throughout my career. When I started as the higher ed reporter slash editor at the Huffington Post back in 2012, it was edtech was something I was very quickly bored by. I mean, back then though, it was like, the pitches were all about MOOCs, and it was like, oh, okay. So a bunch of people sign up and take a class. Interesting. The end. Like, I don't know. There just was nothing more to it back then, and I didn't really think deeper about what was necessarily changing. I've always kind of gravitated towards cultural things or things where there is some sort of activism, whether it's from students, parents, community members. Um, the short version is I'm now on an enterprise desk, which for people not in journalism just means we kind of tend to do more features or big stories, investigations, not necessarily, day in, day out. Here's what the education department announced. Here's what's going on with regulations or whatever. So just my background in education often leads me back towards paying attention to those circles. Last year, I was covering a lot of stuff around the Trump administration and everything that it was doing and still is doing to education. And about halfway through, there was actually this article in the New York Times about college professors using AI and some students feeling like, wait, you're doing the thing you've been yelling at us not to do. That kind of sparked some discussions internally from NBC News editors. For some reason, that was a story that broke through, and they asked a couple of us, like, hey, like, yes, pay attention to what Trump's doing, but also, AI is becoming a bigger factor. What's going on? That's clearly going to be changing things. I started making some calls. I ended up stumbling upon a story about, well, this one came in as a tip about a conflict between a big virtual school and a rural school district in New Mexico. And then right after that, I was still kind of poking around, calling people. And one of the stories I sort of landed on was folks in LA were organizing to protest against schools having so much reliance on technology. The simple thing that stood out to me was LAUSD had banned out iPhones, but then was requiring students to use iPads every day. And that simple sort of, I don't know, it seemed like a contradiction to us.
Yeah.
They're so similar. Sure, filters, whatever, they're doing it for schoolwork. But the stories I was hearing were not just, I just don't want them using a screen. It was, my kid has to take iReady all day, or all day each Tuesday for iReady Tuesdays at middle school,
Right.
including in gym class. And I was like, wait, what? Like, it was just stuff like that. And then I listened to a lot of parent listening sessions and spent weeks talking to people to understand what was going on. And it stood out to me like this was one of the first districts. The only other one I could find was Evanston, Illinois, where parents were organizing around screens. It wasn't necessarily even AI.
Right.
And so watching some of the school board meetings, it wasn't just because I'm located in LA, but LA, such a big district. And this seemed notable because there were so many parents coming out and showing up at these listening sessions. And so that I did that first story back in December 2025, and since then there just seemed like there was a lot more to explore here, and uh, it clearly there has been.
Yeah. And people obviously are liking the stories, and you've kept writing them, for which I at least am grateful. When did you know you'd written about edtech before? You knew that edtech could sometimes be either sort of exaggerated in terms of its potential, or maybe sometimes people were unnecessarily fearful. When did you realize that this was going to be a big story, arguably one of the biggest stories of 2026?
I actually spent a lot of December researching. I mean, there was so much more that we didn't fit into that story about LAUSD, but I spent a lot of time researching, um, and came up with a whole big sort of, I don't know, dossier report for myself about what was going on and what the research was showing, um, where I thought things might go. And I told my editors that this was an area I wanted to stay on. In January, I was the first to report on some internal records from Google that had been filed in the big social media addiction litigation, talking about how they saw their work in schools as building a quote pipeline of future users, or at least tapping into one, if not building one. And there was just a lot of like that got a lot of attention. And I think that was something that sort of reinforced to my editors, like, yes, Tyler's onto something. Let him keep going.
Yeah.
Let him cook, as the kids say. And so, yeah, I just wanted to. I mean, a lot of parents were reaching out too. I told them I had never seen, going back to that LA story, I had never had so many emails in response to any story I've ever done. And they were almost all like constructive, like, hey, this is happening in my kid's school in Kansas or whatever. Like, and they were like, people were really engaged about it. And our executive editor of our newsroom told me later that he saw it in the wild, so to speak, because he saw someone who he knew in New York who just posted it on their Instagram. And there's a weird thing sometimes for us as journalists, like, we look at numbers, we kind of, especially at a bigger outlet, you get sort of numb to like big numbers for readers. But then you start seeing other people talk about your story that and they don't realize like, oh, it's your story. That kind of resonated. So it just seemed like we had struck a nerve, and so I think I knew pretty quickly after we published the LA story back in December that this was going to be something I was going to stay on. But I didn't realize how quickly it would explode. It sort of has exploded on the only thing I can compare it to is sort of the culture war, critical race theory explosion of 2021. But I do want to clarify, like, this is very different. This is not something pushed by a bunch of like political organizations.
Right. Is it your sense that the interest and the concern is authentic? Do you have any worries about it being astroturfed in any way?
No, it is not. It just absolutely is not. I've heard people say this, that it's organized. I mean, there was, I'm not going to say names here, but like there was someone from a group, I was watching a webinar of theirs from last week or the week before, saying like, it does feel like this is a bit more organized. It's not grassroots. That's not true. It is absolutely grassroots. I can say that because I covered the growth of like the book ban, the anti-LGBTQ critical race theory hysteria. There might have been parents who were genuinely concerned, but they weren't sitting around studying pedagogy and going, I see the hallmarks of critical theory in my kids' schoolwork. No,
Right.
they had to be told, hey, you should watch out for this. And this thing actually qualifies as critical race theory.
Mhm.
They may then have genuine concerns and join, not because they're making money or because they're trying to elect anybody. But this is not that. This is like parents who are very broad in terms of their political affiliations. You can go back. This is one of the interesting things, is how much of this has already been happening for years. I mean, Utah is a good example. There's a couple districts where parents have been going to school board meetings for like 2 years, complaining about the stuff that we're hearing about a lot this
Mhm.
year,
Mhm.
with Chromebooks in schools. This is just something that, like, to sort of compare it again to the critical race theory hysteria. This is more, I don't know, almost caveman like. It's just very simple to them. They're like, why so much screen? Like they're not conflating it with social media. That's the other thing, is like I hear a lot of people say, well, they're just conflating doom scrolling with you know,
Mhm.
pedagogically sound, intentional edtech that has a lot of research behind it. It may have research behind it and it may have value, but what they're seeing is an accumulation of what their kids are doing. I hear
Right.
stories of
Right.
parents saying, I checked with my seventh grader and I wanted to see what she's doing on her school laptop. And she shows me, oh, for this class, I have to go to this platform. For this class, I go to that. Before they know it, she's got like 14 tabs open and
Right.
going, are you overwhelmed yet? Because I am. That's
Yeah.
the kind of thing that's driving these parents. It's very much what they see on the laptops at home, and they're
Mhm.
looking directly at the edtech software.
Mhm.
Um,
What do you
so
make
yeah,
of
I
the?
do. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. What do you make on the topic of concerns that people have or misperceptions that they may have about what's really going on? I saw a Chalkbeat interview with a LAUSD school board member asking the question whether this was just a bougie, upper middle class, sort of elitist concern. What do you think about the question or the reality of that?
I do think it is something to grapple with for sure. I mean, I know that was one of the early responses from uh, LAUSD's superintendent on leave, Alberto Carvalho, that restricting to some means elimination to others. That was almost his direct quote at one school board meeting a few months
Mm-hmm.
ago. That that's valid, but there's also a reverse of this. If you buy into what these parents are saying and their concerns, like let's just assume they're all correct. Jared Cooney Horvath is correct. The digital delusion should not be questioned. Let's just assume that for this, that then it's these parents who are more educated, college educated, perhaps, two parent homes, perhaps more money and more time to do this research, to organize, to join these groups, than the single parent, maybe a grandparent or someone taking care of a kid on a single income, maybe multiple kids. They're not going to have as much time to look into all of this. So there's also a sort of a reverse equity question as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why the issue just needs a lot of people to talk to each other. I mean, I don't want to say like all these parents are absolutely correct in everything that they complain about.
Mm-hmm.
That's never the case on any issue.
Mm-hmm.
But it is something like for sure people should consider it.
What's the response from your point of view? I know you're out there reporting and writing your own stories, but to the extent that you've been glancing at it, how robust or anemic has the response been from other outlets, other journalists, other newsrooms onto the story? Has it been robust or has it been less so?
Um, I don't know. That's a good question, the way that's phrased. I didn't see stuff right away at the beginning of the year. I mean, certainly some, especially ed trade organizations, saw this was happening. Um, I think people noticed in the education circles very quickly about Jared Cooney Horvath's digital delusion book and the impact that was having. That also
Mhm.
was, I think, largely driven by his appearance at the Senate Commerce Committee in January.
Right.
Um, and like the clips from that have gone fairly viral, and I think some of the debates are actually more over his testimony than the book. Um, so I think like that hearing also kind of put it on a lot of reporters' radars. I started noticing more of the general interest mass audience competitors for us at NBC News, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, sort of covering
Mhm.
this a little later as like the spring came, and some of them are great stories, and I'm jealous of a couple of them. Um, I wish I would have done them or thought of them, or I had thought of them and I just haven't had time. So there has been some like really good coverage. I think it's been sort of challenging. I don't know. You'd have to ask them, but I am curious because when I look back at for some of these stories and try to find old clips about the history of a certain company, I look at some of the old stories and I don't see a lot of pushback, whether that's like a local newspaper or a trade publication. I don't know if they just didn't know to push back. I don't know if that just wasn't their, to them that wasn't the story at the time.
Hmm.
um I'm kind of curious about that because I've thought about that with my own reporting. It's like what, again, like the examples of school districts where parents have been talking about this for a couple of years. What what did we miss? I've looked back on my own. One of the first stories I did when I came to NBC News, I started January 2020. The first story I came in with, enterprise story that I wanted to do, was about how all of these efforts for school shooting tip lines and some of the software to monitor student Chromebooks, like Gaggle, for example, had it wasn't so much that they were stopping a bunch of school shootings, but they were actually stopping a lot of suicides. And I wrote about that. And I remember at the time just thinking, oh, Gaggle works because they can monitor the Google Docs because they're on a school issued Chromebook. And that's just how they all do their homework now in high school. And I just didn't give a second thought about it because I've had a laptop handed to me by every employer since I graduated college. So sure, why not? I think there's just a lot that like had sort of happened in this tech space in schools over the years that people maybe just didn't think twice about. And really, I don't know that we would be talking about it now if it were for the impact of the anxious generation.
Right.
And the fact that that led to policy changes then led to this. Again, back to the LAUSD story, ban
Hmm.
iPhones but require iPads. I think
Yeah.
that is what really opened the door to a lot of
Yeah.
this.
You mentioned stories that you were jealous of. I want to start. I want to ask you about that, but I want to start out by saying that there's some stories that I think people are jealous of you for having written. The early start, identifying iReady, at least in terms of mainstream news publications, as a focal point or a flashpoint. Can't be fun to be them right now. The story about the pushback that you did, for every drama going on in schools and school board meetings, there are oftentimes very well funded players reacting, responding, trying to change the narrative. You wrote a great story about how the tech companies are worried. They're probably even more worried now in the intervening weeks and months since you wrote that story. So, two questions. First of all, do you have any information about whether the the backlash has resulted in widespread? Is it widespread in terms of its effect now? It's certainly widespread in terms of the conversation, but has it had a widespread effect on edtech companies or purchases or renewals thus far? And then I want to ask you about the stories that you were jealous of.
Yeah, it's hard to say about the purchases. I mean, I'm going to be monitoring the DC City Council today for they're going to be considering their contract on iReady, and that's facing a bunch of pushback from parents who, it's interesting. One of the leaders of that group is a attorney I've known for years who's worked on child sexual assault cases involving schools, Title IX
Mm-hmm.
issues,
Mm-hmm.
and worked at Carrie Goldberg's firm, and she's best known for a lawyer fighting revenge porn. She's represented Weinstein victims and others. So it's again, I don't think like I don't think these parents come to this with any sort of political motivation as much as genuine concerns. As far as like the contracts, the money changing, that's hard to say. I think this is all very new. The way that these contracts are often built are anywhere from 1 to 3 years to 5 years. What I
Yeah.
hear a lot is like they're not doing a lot of like extended 5 year contracts. It's much more quick because the
Right.
technology is changing. But I don't know, like I think it's having an effect. There's a lot of I monitor a lot of like local news stories through Google Alerts, and I see a lot of more districts are talking about it at their board meetings. So I
Mhm.
think people are considering it. There was, I wrote about like the state legislation. Not all of it passed, but
Mhm.
it does not passing one year doesn't mean it's dead. Everyone
Right.
knows that, and so I think this conversation is going to be ongoing. I think it'll be interesting to see how many change things over the summer while things
Yeah.
are sort of quiet, and then just start the fall with a new experiment. Um, but I mean, I don't think the market's gonna die because I don't think like we're gonna get rid of computers. I mean, some of the parents just want them to, some of them just don't make my kid take it home because the
Right.
problems when they take it home, it's
Yeah.
just leave it at school at a cart. Like
Yeah.
that's
Put it
all
back in the
some
cart.
parents want. Yeah.
Yeah. I
The
talked to
other
the.
thing, go
I'm sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the other thing is like the AI of it all. I think there's still anxiety and like lawmakers pushing that like whatever we feel about AI, people need to know it and know how to use it. And I mean, there was a good story. I forget which one it was. It was a trade publication. Well, I mean, when I say trade, I just mean education focused.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not minimizing them, but it was about like how they're getting inundated with emails because of AI from tech companies that are pitching their products.
Right.
So
Right.
the marketing is not stopping either.
Right. Of course not. You mentioned that there are some stories that you admired or wished you'd had time to do. If you're willing, can you tell us which they were? I'm always curious to hear what stories other journalists admire.
Yeah, the New York Times had that really good one last week, going through all the court records of the social media addiction lawsuit and what the exhibits. The exhibits are where like sort of the meat is
Right.
that shows their conversations there. That was something like I kept hearing people talking about, like the National PTA and their close association
Mhm.
with some of these companies over the years. um, and I saw a lot of people reacting to that out of the story. So I heard about that before. I saw some of it in the court records. Just I had other things I was doing. Anyway, that was a good one.
Mhm.
One of those ones where I like kind of knew what was going on, but I should have pitched it. I don't know. Did I not brief my editor enough? Um, the Wall Street Journal's YouTube story was pretty interesting. I think I like the packaging of it.
Yeah.
That that was good.
This
I
is a Shalini Ramachandran story about schools awash in YouTube.
mhm. Yeah. So those are probably the two I'd point to immediately, and then there's been some local coverage. I mean, I think what's been going on in Lower Merion, that's
Mhm.
a really interesting school district. I
Yeah.
have been in touch with some of the parents there, but I think like that's a fascinating battle, and I've been following the local coverage out of that.
Right.
So
There's a
yeah.
Philadelphia Inquirer reporter who goes up there to cover things. I'm going to forget her name right now. Is there anyone that's if you're willing to say, is there anyone that's sort of a go-to day by day, week by week source, a journalist or someone else who's really just sort of keeping the pulse of this clear?
I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to keep a pulse by, but
And
I
you
don't
definitely,
necessarily like tweet it out or blue sky it out or whatever every day. Um, I honestly am following a lot of the Instagram accounts of these parents groups. They're posting a lot of updates. I'm signing up to a lot of newsletters. Um, some of, and I sign up, to be clear, I sign up to a lot of like pro ed tech
right?
newsletters too. Like I try to digest as much as I can, ingest,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
I'm thinking of lunch. But so I don't know. I'm not, there's not a go-to, there's not a singular one. I've
There's not someone necessarily either leading the way reporting wise, or if I understand you correctly, sort of curating all the coverage or curating all the updates.
No, but what's interesting is I'm finding new people, or like some of these like ed tech podcasts. There's one called like the K-12 Tech Talk, I think is what it's called. I was on their podcast earlier this year, but I had started listening to them before they asked me. I don't know, I just like hearing their perspective. They're coming at it from a school technology director perspective.
Right.
um there's another Audrey Waters. I've been reading her book on personalized learning, and I'm
Mhm.
following her Substack. It's less
Mhm.
of like the ins and outs day to day, but just sort of some good contextual thoughts.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I'm also finding I'm paying a lot more attention to discussions on LinkedIn than ever before. And that may just be where this industry is. I don't know if it's like where people are in 2026.
Mhm.
But I'm finding a lot, sometimes if I'm just curious about a topic, I'll just search on LinkedIn and see who's talking about it. And I
Mhm.
find a lot more interesting voices that way.
What do you think about all the coverage of Alpha School? 10 or so years ago, there was something called Alt School, and there was a young to me guy named Max Ventilla. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, but there was a thing called Alt School, and it got an incredible amount of coverage, and never came to very much, or didn't come to as much as had been hoped. Now we've got Alpha School. What do you think of all the coverage it's received?
Yeah, that's another one. I saw some coverage last year. I feel like the first story I saw was that Bill Ackman was supporting it financially or something. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I saw a series of other stories. Wired, 404 Media both had really good stories about
Yeah,
that. So I'd add those two stories I've been jealous of in this space.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, and then there's more and more, and so it's interesting because that school is both growing and getting a lot of attention, but also getting it feels like sort of an outsized level of scrutiny for how many students it's educating. Um,
outside
and
level
I
of
don't
scrutiny or outside level of coverage, or both.
Well, I think both, because most of the coverage I'm seeing is not laudatory. It's about problems or this being dystopian. And I think like what's been more interesting is like I think it was in the opinion section of the New York Times, but about the first it was an AI. I think it was a public high school in Georgia. Um, that is more interesting to me. I'm always someone who's been more interested in what's happening in public education because that's where a majority of students are educated.
Right.
Same thing with like at the higher ed level. Like I just always think there's way too much focus on elite privates. I don't. I'm in LA. What happens at Harvard Westlake might be interesting, but honestly, who cares? Like it does not change how a majority of kids in this county are growing up. I'm a product of public schools, a community college, a state university, and then a brief program at a private university. I I've always thought I like we should pay much more attention to what happens in public schools.
Right.
Um, so that's I think I sort of admitting I'm not saying I will never cover Alpha School, but that is if I'm being honest and a little maybe overly transparent, I'm often inclined to be like private school, do what you want. I don't as long as
Right.
it's not hurting somebody. I mean,
Right.
really hurting them. I'm not as interested.
There was a famous headline, at least famous to me, 10 or 15 years ago in the Atlantic. The headline was "Shut up about Harvard," uh, in which
I
they
just
were,
run that every day. I don't know.
yeah,
That should just be on
run
the
that every
wall
day. Or,
somewhere.
or,
Yeah.
or we could update it. It could be "Shut up about Alpha School," right?
Maybe in this space. I mean, I think I understand why people are paying attention. It is very out there. But like it seems to me like an experiment. And so when I say like do what you want for private schools, it is
Right.
obviously within reason, but like I think, you know, like at one point Montessori schools were very bizarre to people. So it is and Catholic schools are bizarre to other people. Like it is I grew up again going to public schools and thought my friends who went to the Catholic schools like you have to wear khakis every day. That's so bizarre. Like
Uh,
so but maybe they figure out something good. I don't know. Like it is
yeah.
something where I try to keep an open mind with this all too. I don't want to be so far into like the
Mhm.
Luddite camp. But also I want to remember, like, Luddite is often used as a pejorative, or it has been up until, maybe
Right,
before 2025, 26.
right,
But the Luddites also had a point, and they
right.
were right about things. So I think that is important to always keep in mind.
One last question, and Tyler, thanks so much for doing this, and I encourage everyone to follow the work that you're doing.
Yeah,
How do
happy to
you,
do it. You've been following this world and chronicling it for so long, so I appreciate you bringing me on.
the how would you differentiate? This is not a secret story anymore, right? This edtech backlash story is not a secret anymore. How would you differentiate? So some of the big kids are on the playground now, so to speak. How would you differentiate between what you're doing and what, say, the Times or the Post or NPR are doing? Are there differences that it would help journalists and readers to understand?
I mean, we are always, because this business is competitive, we are always thinking about how to stay ahead of things. And I think there's also a responsibility that we feel when we are one of the big kids as NBC News and a national outlet, that we should, present something to our readers that is going to be worth their while, and hopefully, like, I guess also, like, spend our resources correctly. And those resources include just, my own time, my editor's time,
Mm-hmm.
not just financial. And so we are thinking about that. That was a conversation I was having with my editor before coming to record this. um and I think, like, that's what we're trying to sort of predict, is what's out there in the future. I think there's so much though out there. I mean, if you've seen one classroom, you've seen one classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's room to find, like, here's an interesting way that AI could be used that a lot of people might be fine with. Here is a way that, like, it's gone terribly wrong, or this is dystopian. There there is going to be more developments on that, obviously, too. I think telling the human stories is what often breaks through. That's the stuff I also get a little jealous of, when I'm like, okay, I'm not jealous of that story overall, but people really clung on to that anecdote and in someone else's work. But I think that's because people can relate to this. It's very human. I think
Right.
this idea of how we educate kids, and also, I think a lot of people are imprinting their own anxieties as adults around tech and how much time they spend staring at a screen
Mm-hmm.
onto what's happening at the education level.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think that they're conflating social media with ed tech, but I do think, like, we are in a period where people should not be reflexive to say that person is wrong and has nothing good to say. And so I think that's what I would just encourage other reporters. Like, there's a lot going on. Talk to kids. I'd say that's maybe one area where we haven't heard enough, is like, what do kids think? What do students think? And sometimes, a fish only knows the water it swims in. So maybe they haven't thought twice about this, but I do think we should spend some time talking to them. And there might be, like, I will just say one quick thing is, one of the things that stood out to me on a recent school visit, to witness a school district where 2 days of the week they didn't use any tech, but then the other days they did. One thing that stood out to me was, on the days they didn't use tech, all the kids were chattier. They were a little more squirrelier in the hall.
Right.
The later surveys showed that was a big takeaway that teachers and students identified. And it made me start thinking, what is the value of just chatting, of just, I don't know, like, I thought about my own experience. Like, I wasn't the A student, but I made friends by, teacher asks a question, I might chime in with something a little class clownish, not
Uh-huh.
push the envelope too much, but like enough that, like, someone thinks, oh, he's a funny guy, I'll, hang out with him at lunch. And then I talked to my editor, and she's like, that's how I learned I don't like, you know, public speaking. I don't want to be called on. And there's a lot of things that I think sometimes we just discount, of, like, about growing up, about, how we are socialized, that I think that would be also something really interesting. There's probably a million nuggets like that reporters could find just by kind of observing, or just, clinging on to something very small. I mean, there could be someone could make a beat out of covering recess, to be honest. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot more as I've covered tech in schools.
Tyler Kingkade from NBC News, thank you so much for being on the show. I can't wait to see what your next story is.
Oh, thank you so much.